watching on the live stream, we need the mics so that they can hear us rather than just the people in the room. I'm very excited to welcome Emma Chandler-Avery and Weston Konishi here to discuss the papers that they've written in a series of papers that we commissioned on Japan, regional security regional security issues. Of course, that was with the very kind sponsorship of the Consulate General of Japan in Chicago, and we're happy to welcome Consul General Naoki Ito here with us today for the sponsorship and the continued partnership and helping us to bring more and more, I think, attention to Japan in the Midwest, also in Chicago, and then being able to bring in authors, bring in speakers, get them into Chicago where I think we don't often have a good discussion or a good ongoing discussion on some of the broader policy issues in Asia. You know, they're in from Washington, where I think it's somewhat always on the mind, always being discussed, and it is very prominent at the think tanks there, at the conferences, and so it's good to bring some of their expertise here as well. Please note that we are on the record. We are live streaming, as mentioned, and we welcome any engagement on social media for those of you on the live stream. We also have the ability to accept questions online through chi.inf.io. I also want to remind everyone that the views expressed by the speakers and perhaps by myself do not represent that of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs or perhaps their institutions that they work for as well. They are personal comments and their own insights for them. I'll take a few minutes to introduce our speakers. First, on my right, Emma Chandler-Avery. She's a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service. She joined CRS in 2003 through the Presidential Management Fellowship with rotations in the State Department on the Korea desk and at the Joint U.S. Military Advisory Group in Bangkok. She was educated at Amherst College and Columbia University. Next up on my left is Weston Konishi. He is a senior fellow at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. From 2015 to 2016, he was the inaugural William Reinsch Visiting Lecturer of East Asian Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. He received his bachelor's and master's degree from the International Christian University in Mitaka, Tokyo, where he was awarded a Monbusho Scholarship. So I already mentioned that they had written papers for us. I believe we have them available over there. Emma wrote on Japan, the Indo-Pacific, and the Quad, and Weston wrote on China's maritime challenge in the South China Sea, options for U.S. responses. If you're not in the room and watching on the live stream, these are available on our website for download. It's an issue that we've talked a lot about. Too often I think North Korea dominates the headlines these days with the upcoming summits, with all of the diplomacy, the surprise visit to Beijing by Kim Jong-Un, and our attention has been somewhat taken away from the areas south of there, of which there is a lot. The South China Sea is in ongoing disputes. We've seen recently that Vietnam has been, dissuaded from drilling for oil by the Chinese. And more broadly than that, Japan has been kind of pushing for a quadrilateral that includes India, the United States, and Australia. So to kick things off, I'm going to turn it over to Wes for about 10 minutes of remarks, where he will go on and kind of cover the topics in his paper, which is dealing with a lot of the U.S. options in the South China Sea, and then we'll then turn to Emma for 10 minutes of remarks to cover her paper. I'll then take moderator's prerogative to ask a few questions, maybe some uncomfortable ones, and then we'll open it up. If you have a question during any time, you can feel free to put up your table tent, and we can proceed that way. So with no further ado, Wes, please.
Thank you, Carl. Let me just begin by thanking you and the Chicago Council for inviting us to this very important event. And I'd like to thank the Consul General as well for your support, and also for sponsoring the paper. It was really a great opportunity to focus in on this important topic. So as Carl said, my paper's on China's maritime challenge in the South China Sea, options for U.S. responses. I'll be very brief because I prefer Q&As, long Q&As, and I think most audiences do as well. I'll just briefly go over what I think China's main challenges are to the U.S. security and strategic interests. what the U.S. is doing currently to mitigate against this challenge, and then what more the U.S. can and should do in the future. So, in a nutshell, China's military capabilities have vastly increased, and this is commensurate with China's growing clout on the world stage, its growing economy. And so in that vein, it's really shifted. Its maritime strategy has shifted from being one that was predominantly preoccupied with shoreline, coastline defense to a naval strategy that's more ambitious, certainly one in which China would like to extend its influence throughout the region in the maritime domain, and also to extend its reach globally. And we've seen this in several Chinese deployments to places like the Gulf of Aden and elsewhere, where China is beginning to develop a kind of maritime footprint. Along with it, and so it has focused a lot of its strategic attention to the East China Sea, and this has led to tensions with Japan in particular. And it has shifted its attention, of course, to the South China Sea, where it has engaged in a number of activities that are of concern to U.S. policymakers and strategists. Concurrently, China is undertaking a major arms buildup, what they call modernization of their military. And of course, this applies to their naval fleet as well. Some analysts predict that by the year 2030, China will have a 500-ship navy. That's quite large. At the same point in the future, some people project the U.S. to have a fleet of some 350 vessels by comparison. So there's really a growing gap in terms of the amount of military assets that are being deployed by China in the Pacific region. This, of course, creates enormous challenges for U.S. policymakers, and in particular, China's approach to this, to its growing influence in the region, has been a particular dilemma for American policymakers, and that's because it's employed what's often called gray zone strategies. So that is really not taking overt military action to claim territories that are in dispute, but taking actually much more subtle approaches to expand their influence and their control in the maritime domain. And they've done this primarily through the use of civilian and paramilitary vessels that they've deployed throughout the South China Sea. And again, this creates a great dilemma for the United States and its allies in the region, who largely are outnumbered and outgunned by China's civilian vessels, and have largely at their disposal more hard military assets, what we call gray hull ships, as opposed to China's civilian white hull ships. So in using that kind of gray zone strategy of deploying civilian and paramilitary assets, China's been able to expand its foothold in the region. It's engaged in a very aggressive land reclamation operation in the region. This really heated up. It started around 2013, but it really kind of peaked in 2015. And currently, China now has some 3,200 acres of reclaimed islands throughout the South China Sea. So very much an expansion of China's strategic foothold in the region. The U.S. measures so far have predominantly focused on deploying what's called freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs. These are American vessels and aircraft that are flown very close to China's claimed territories and islets in the region. And this has demonstrated the U.S.'s long time kind of policy and strategy in which it has promised to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law permits it. So that's the principle under which the United States Navy approaches these maritime issues. And this is a diametrically different perspective and approach than what the Chinese have. The Chinese have a much more restrictive interpretation of how it can guard its exclusive economic zones in the maritime domain. And so they've been very upset by these operations. But they have primarily voiced their opposition to these in the diplomatic realm, not really taking military action thus far, which is very important. But the possibility, I think, of some kind of unintended conflict erupting from the fact that you have so much military equipment deployed in very confined spaces leads to the possibility that there could be some miscalculation that would lead to an escalation of hostilities. And that's something that I think all sides don't want and that we're trying to avoid. Nevertheless, I think it's, as the United States, particularly under the Trump administration, ramps up its FONOPs in the region, the possibility for this kind of an accident to occur, I think, increases. Nonetheless, I think given all the enormous changes that we all know about that's happened in the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, I think the Trump administration has largely, in this respect, emphasized a policy and strategy of continuity rather than a complete departure. Obama as well was exercising FONOPs in the region, and that was his main approach to dealing with this dilemma. So what needs to happen in the future? Obviously, this is not an easy problem to solve. But I think there are several things that we need to continue to do and some changes that we need to make. I'll just throw a few of these out there. First, I think China needs to be continuously reminded of the fact that the costs of its land reclamation activities should come at the expense of its overall interests in the international community, that the costs outweigh the benefits, in other words, of these activities. I think that the U.S. and its allies, including and I think primarily Japan, need to consistently call out China in the future as China continues to engage in these activities. One of the important steps that both Japan and the United States have undertaken to deal with this has been to increase aid and provide capacity building for other actors in the region, like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and others, so that they can develop their own capabilities to fend off Chinese vessels in disputed territories. Part of this also includes increasing these allies and friends' maritime domain awareness, that is, their technical ability to survey the seas, to understand where incursions are happening, at what pace they're happening, what kind of assets are being deployed in these incursions, et cetera. Another thing that I think is important for the U.S. to do is to ratify finally the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which is a formal agreement under the UN rubric that provides a legal framework for best practices and norms in the maritime domain. This is something that even naval commanders in the U.S. Navy have approved of and support, but for various reasons has never been ratified in the Senate. So this is something that I think would send a strong signal that the United States is still a leader in providing for best practices and norms in the maritime domain. And this leads me to sort of my final point, which is that I think the U.S., it's clear from what's evolved and from the problems that this crisis has brought to light, that the international order is extremely important, that there are rules and norms that need to be protected, that need to be upheld and enhanced. And the United States, if we look at this really closely, plays an indispensable role in leading this system. And it's something that I think that's very much under challenge right now under this administration as it focuses on its America First agenda as it starts to retreat from a lot of multilateral institutions, both globally and regionally. All of these things, I think, send a signal to China that it can exploit some of the and take an opportunistic advantage of this leadership vacuum that we're seeing in some corners of the region. So I think it's really important that the United States maintain these regimes and systems moving forward and work very closely with our allies, including Japan. And primarily, I would say Japan is one of our most important maritime partners. But I think Emma will talk more about the other important partners and allies that the United States has.
Before turning it over to Emma, I want to follow up on one question and push you on one point. You talked about the need to continue to supply some of the countries in Southeast Asia around the South China Sea with means to defend themselves, or perhaps kind of change the cost-benefit analysis. But what good has that done so far? So we continue to send patrol boats into Vietnam, but the consequences, and if it's missiles or whatever it is, but the consequences for them, if they were to use those, would be so overwhelming that it seems that they would never even get close to using them anyway. That they know that they would then, if it's not a military retaliation, that at least the economic retaliation from China would essentially crush them. And so why do we continue to send military arms there if it's not going to really change the situation all that much?
Right. I mean, I think that, you're largely right about that point. And I don't think that what we're trying to do is create some sort of parity of capabilities. But I think it's, to be frank, a lot of these countries actually have very underdeveloped coast guards, very underdeveloped navies, quite, to use a crude term, primitive in a way. I mean, understaffed, under-resourced, underdeveloped. So merely providing patrol boats, for instance, to a place like Vietnam or the Philippines can make quite a difference. I mean, it can give them at least the capacity to patrol their own waters that they didn't have before. So you're right that this doesn't really create any equilibrium in terms of the strategic balance in the region, but I think it does give these countries some much-needed capabilities that they didn't have before.
Emma?
Great. Thanks, Wes. Thanks, Carl, and the council, as well as Mr. Consul General for providing this opportunity for me to come. I do have to reiterate that these views are my own. I work for the Congressional Research Service, which is a small government agency, so I certainly don't represent the views of CRS or the U.S. Congress in any way. And I'm going to talk as long as I can to avoid the uncomfortable questions, I guess. But I'm just going to run through my topic on the Indo-Pacific, as well as the Quad. You've probably heard this catchphrase emerging as a new framework for addressing security challenges in East Asia. We heard it as a refrain from President Trump when he went on his marathon trip through the region in November. This was originally championed by Prime Minister Abe several years ago during his first term. And the operational component of this appears to be this Quad, this idea of joining all of the major maritime democracies in the region. We saw officials from these 4 countries meet together on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in November. So there is a lot of curiosity about what this means, the free and open Indo-Pacific, as well as where the Quad is going, if anywhere. So I'd like to just briefly examine Japan's motivations for getting this initiative started, talk about some of its challenges, and then offer, at the end, some of my thoughts on the prospects of this moving forward. Japan really has been the primary cheerleader for this effort. It's, of course, motivated largely by concern over China's rising economic and security influence in the region. Japan is also very interested in maintaining U.S. leadership in the region, too. And through this framework, it's a way to keep the United States engaged. I mean, for years, but maybe particularly under this last administration, there's concern that the United States doesn't have the same staying power in the region that they may have had before. Abe particularly has worked very hard to expand security ties with India and Australia, 2 of the other major partners in this Quad arrangement. And it has a strong interest in building a regional order in the region that is not totally dominated by Beijing. And we've seen a lot of other initiatives come out of China, the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, the AIIB to fund infrastructure projects, alternative trade deals like the RCEP, which I think stands for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So this is a way to create some sort of structure in the region that is not completely dominated by China. Just talking briefly about the other partners, India, I think, has a particular appeal to Japan as a maritime power in the region. Prime Minister Abe and the leader of India, Modi, seem to have really strong personal chemistry. I mean, Abe is one of these guys who sort of likes to be a buddy with these other sort of strong, generally male leaders, and they seem to have pretty strong chemistry. They've had a lot of summits together. They've developed new economic partnerships, new security partnerships, new dialogues. There's not the same historical tension that surrounds a lot of Japan's relationships with other countries in the region. They have a similar background in terms of religion. Personally, Abe's lineage, also his grandfather, Prime Minister Kishi, also had a strong relationship with India, gave Japan's first overseas development aid to India, actually. So on many levels, I think that India sort of appeals to Japan and specifically to Abe. India also has this look east policy now, and I think they're now saying act east, which dovetails really well with Japan wanting to reach out to India. Both of the countries also, of course, have some suspicions about Chinese intentions. Both of them have territorial disputes with China as well. So that's another way in which I think they see eye to eye. With Australia as well, Japan has really deepened their ties, particularly in the security field as well as in some economic initiatives. There's an appeal with the Australian forces being pretty interoperable with U.S. military forces, so it offers some complementary relationships that way between the three countries. And in this case, too, Abe has personally invested some time in repairing what may have been some historical grievances in Australia. Obviously, they had a difficult history together of World War II, but I think it was in 2014, Abe gave a big speech in front of the Australian Parliament where he expressed remorse that I think went a long way towards shoring up that political relationship. I want to just mention, because this has been an interesting thing for me, where the Korean Peninsula fits in to this, to the Quad or into the Indo-Pacific. And part of me feels like South Korea gets a little marginalized by this. I mean, South Korea, after all, is a democracy as well, has maritime interests, although not the same sort of naval forces that these other countries do. Although I think really that South Korea would rather not be invited to the Quad. South Korea has a lot of sensitivity about offending China, and China, I think, tends to see this as encircling. And I think that South Korea is pretty tentative right now about doing anything that would upset their relationship with Beijing. But of course, this makes it a little bit easier for Japan as well. Because traditionally when they have tried to work together, there have been political disputes, a lot of history concerns between the two countries. So it does make it easier, I think, for Japan to engage with the United States, Australia, and India without South Korea being in the picture. But let's just talk now sort of like where's the beef? What is this concept all about? In the 2007 version of this, the first time Abe was in office, they formed this Quad, and there was an initial sort of burst of excitement that these countries could work together. It actually goes back further than Prime Minister Abe's first time in office. It grew out of the response to the really devastating 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean, where there was a massive relief effort, and I think fairly organically, India, Australia, the United States, and Japan started to work together. So that was sort of the genesis of this whole grouping. So they tried to boost that again, and after one round of exercises, naval exercises, that I believe also included Singapore, it sort of dissolved. And a lot of that, I think, had to do with the leadership of all the countries leaving office. I mean, obviously, Abe left office then. President Bush became, much less popular here in his waning years. Howard had to step down. Singh lost popularity. So it really seemed to be driven by the top. That is a concern today as well. Prime Minister Abe right now is facing his own political struggles with the revival of this scandal. There's a question mark about whether or not he's going to achieve this third term that I think has been his goal. I mean, time will tell. We've seen Abe weather some of these other storms, but I think it's so dependent on the leadership at the top, and certainly Prime Minister Abe has been among the most it's not quite aggressive, but assertive in trying to have a more muscular posture for Japan. So without his leadership there, I'm not sure that this Quad idea can develop much further. There's lacking an economic component of this. With the United States withdrawing from the TPP, I think that without the economic side of this, it's going to be hard to keep the free and open Indo-Pacific going. What does free and open really mean, right? If you don't have these liberalizing trade regimes in place, or at least without the United States involvement, what does it mean? Does it mean open societies? Because democracy has really fallen as part of the major foreign policy agenda under this administration. Are we just talking about open seas for commerce, or are we talking about more freedom for these countries? I don't think that we really have the answer to that. And if we don't have sort of the values, democratic values as part of this initiative, and we don't have an economic component, that sort of leaves it really just to the security realm. And that tends to be the thing that would arouse China's mistrust the most, which would cause China probably to put a lot of pressure on India, on Australia, to not be as engaged as they could be. There's also, this may seem sort of like inside the beltway here, but we are lacking some bureaucratic capacity in Washington now. There are a lot of positions that have not been filled in the State Department and in the Defense Department. And if you want this to be a dialogue that's ongoing, even if it's really just a place to get together, then you've got to put people on planes. They've got to get to the region, put these things together. And we really are suffering on the personnel side in the United States right now. So I'm a little bit wary that they're going to be able to put together these dialogues if you don't have those people in place. We also have plenty to distract us in the Korean Peninsula right now. I work on security issues in East Asia, from Southeast Asia to Japan, the Korean Peninsula, and I have done little else other than North Korea for the past year. I mean, it sucks all of the oxygen out of the room. All of the requests coming from members of Congress and their staff have to do with North Korea. So without the sort of attention devoted to this Indo-Pacific idea, I'm a little skeptical whether it can really get off the ground. We do have a couple of opportunities to see if we can take this quad for a spin, though. The Malabar naval exercises are now a U.S., India, and Japan trilateral exercise, but Australia has expressed some interest in joining in the next round, which I believe are slated for the summer, maybe July or something. India, interestingly, has pushed back on that and has not been welcoming of Australia coming in. So I think there's already some resistance to getting this operationalized, but if they do indeed invite Australia in and we get some diplomats over to the region to have some working level talks, then it'll provide some momentum for this initiative that I think would give Prime Minister Abe a boost in the region. And I'll stop there.
So one very quick follow-up. Right at the end, you mentioned that India was pushing back against Australia joining in on these Malabar naval exercises. Can you expand on that point a bit? Why are they pushing back?
I know India not particularly well at all, and I find it somewhat baffling. I just went to India for the first time, actually, last month. But what the explanation that's been given to me is that India still remembers that, to them, Australia was the one that broke the Quad the last time. they changed government from Howard to the Labour Party, and felt that, I think Australia was the first one to really pull the plug there. So I think it's partly there. And again, there's probably some portions of the bureaucracy or of the security establishment in India that are getting pressure from Beijing to not let this go forward. China responded very forcefully last time in 2007. And I think that India and Australia are very dependent on China for their trade and are reluctant to really damage the relationship.
Then won't that same thing happen again this time around? Are we now in a different space in the way we think about China? Before it was, under the Obama administration, it was all about bringing them into the international community. They were going to be a responsible stakeholder. And now it seems like everyone has kind of shifted the other way.
Right.
Let's say. So are now people more willing to, I don't want to use the word punish China, but at least be a little more aggressive, and if China pushes back against being encircled, that they're willing to see it out this time? Or are we going to go right back to as an idea and then seeing it break down?
Well, time will tell, but I think that as you laid out, before the approach was really about bringing China into the international system. But there are certainly those that argue that hasn't worked out. I mean, look what's happened over the last 10 years. China has become increasingly assertive, expanded its spheres of influence in ways that Australia and India find somewhat disconcerting. So that may be part of what would change the equation for them.
All right. Again, we'll open it up to the floor. If you have a table tent, put it up. If you don't have a table tent, you can raise your hand, perhaps. Tom Bodine.
Commander Bodine, U.S. Navy. My question is, you mentioned some susceptibility to China's influences if the Quad remains only in the security realm. Who is most at risk out of the Quad, to include the United States, to break away from the Quad based off of pressure from China? And what do you think the specific lever that China is going to pull to make that happen?
I think that India and Australia are probably those that are the most vulnerable to economic pressure from Beijing. I think that China is the #1 trade partner for both of those countries. So they have, they're putting a lot on the line to do this. I do not think that, the U.S.-China relationship is very complicated, many, many layers. We may be headed towards a really confrontational stance in the trade realm, for instance, right now. But I do think that in the past, it was really New Delhi and Canberra that felt the most pressure from Beijing.
Which of those two, then, would you say?
Which, between India and Australia? Mm-hmm. I think that depends on the leadership in place somewhat. Australia doesn't have these direct territorial disputes with China that India does have. They have a long border, and periodically there have been, flare-ups on these border disputes. But I don't know the economics of each country to know which would feel the pain the fastest. I would imagine that it has to do with these are both democracies, obviously, public opinion, and the way that whether or not these leaders choose to, sort of stand up to Beijing, or whether or not they take a more conciliatory approach.
John Macca.
So China's operating at a pretty significant advantage right now with Xi Jinping consolidating power. So they have a clear strategy. They have less internal politics they have to deal with right now than some of the countries, especially in the Quad. So if we're moving toward less of a working with and more of a containment strategy, how do we consolidate a long-term strategy among all these countries? Or do you feel stronger that we need to be looking at ways to work together? And then I guess follow-up question is, what are ways that we can work together with Beijing?
Do you want?
Well, I would just, I'm kind of a skeptic of the Quad. I don't think that you're.
I'm not a big cheerleader.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of hurdles that need to be overcome before it really materializes. Emma really touched on the key ones, but I would just add to that. I think India is really very much on the fence with this. And this comes not just from their concerns about their relationship with China, but also because of their tradition in the non-aligned movement in the Cold War, in which they were reluctant to take sides, be it the U.S.-led system or the Soviet system. So that's their tradition. That's really in their DNA. It's baked into it, I think, and it's very difficult for them to come out explicitly and overtly and join something like this kind of strategic relationship with other countries that may appear antagonistic toward a neighbor. So that's one of the key things that I think needs to be stressed as well. And so, I think that the smartest move would be to continue to try to integrate China into the international system. But the way I think we see political trends happening globally now, in which the sort of fabric that's keeping international society together is being frayed. It's not just, it's being, a lot of it is on our shoulders, of course, but I think other countries are looking skeptically at the international order, look at the Brexit, scenario, for instance. So I think it's a hard sell right now politically across the globe. But I think that's probably, I would say that's the best way to ensure that we have a sustainable and productive relationship with China over the long term.
Just a small thing for that. One thing I've heard people say it might be an area where you could try and do some cooperative activity with China is around the Horn of Africa and Djibouti, where the U.S., Japan, China all have facilities there, and they've worked together on counter-piracy issues. It's sort of small potatoes when you're talking about the rest of this stuff, but at least it's an area where you could start to do some confidence-building measures.
That's right here.
Hi, yes, I had a question about the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. I'm wondering whether that addresses in any manner this issue of land reclamation, and whether what it says or doesn't say about island building has to do for its chances of being ratified.
I'm not a maritime legal expert, so I don't know the ins and outs of UNCLOS, but my understanding is that it doesn't necessarily touch directly on, as it currently exists, on the issue of land reclamation. That's still a fuzzy area in international maritime law. But what I think is important is that a country as important as the United States, with a Navy as thoroughly invested in that part of the world, and needs to be seen to be upholding conventional rules of the game. So I think that joining the UNCLOS would send a very strong signal that there are certain norms and rules that need to be followed. And I think that UNCLOS is really, I see it as an imperfect product of the Cold War, when we're sort of, it's a child of the Cold War, in which, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are trying to work out ways in which they could sort of manage to be, manage to operate in the same areas without triggering a shooting war. But there's a lot to be done in terms of filling out the ambiguities of UNCLOS, and I think that's exactly one area where we could really focus on that. But we need to be a part of it, a signatory to it, in order to really change it.
UNCLOS is actually very specific on this
Is it?
issue. And artificial islands are not natural islands, and therefore have no territorial seas and no exclusive economic zone associated with them. The ability to build artificial islands is not necessarily discounted, and in fact, if it is in your EEZ, you have the ability to build artificial islands. You cannot claim territorial seas or extend your economic zone because of those.
Daisy chaining.
Correct. Yeah.
Craig?
So, Wes, in your remarks, you talked a bit about some of the things that the U.S. could do and some of the things it is currently doing, like FONOPS. Is anyone else doing any of these things that you suggest in your paper? Or is the U.S. sort of the only one out there doing FONOPS, thinking about how to combat this cabbage strategy that you talk about?
Right. FONOPS is really, as far as I know, is really being undertaken primarily by the U.S. Navy. I might stand corrected on that, but other navies haven't joined in that regard. However, Japan has been a key partner with the U.S. in terms of capacity building in the region. And the Abe administration, I think, has been relatively warm about that, taking on more of those responsibilities. The U.S. would like to see more of that. I think the U.S. needs more partners, but the problem is that if you look around the region, there aren't a whole lot of other countries that have the kind of resources, maritime resources, financial resources, economic resources that Japan can bring to bear. So actually the pool of partners when you're talking about this kind of aid is relatively finite. But I certainly think that there's a lot more that can be done in terms of capacity building with other partners, confidence building measures with other countries, et cetera.
Okay, well, we'll take one. We still have time. We have one more question from Ed, but I also have a list of online questions here, and they are all North Korea. So if this is not North Korea related, we'll take this one, of course, and then we'll perhaps spend the last 10 to 15 minutes addressing some of these. Of course, if there are other questions in the room, we can take those. And of course, the Consul General will take his question. Before going to North Korea, we'll squeeze two more in.
Thank you both for your comments. Very much appreciated. During your initial presentation, Weston, you talked about, and there's a little bit of a variation of Carl's question, on the costs and benefits, changing the equation of the costs and benefits of this land reclamation that China undergoes in the South China Sea. And I'm very curious, talk to me about increasing their costs. I mean, I don't see it, but I'm very interested in how you can increase the cost to how you can change that equation for China. And then I'll throw a question to both of you, and it also relates to one of your comments just a moment ago, Weston. You know, continuing the strategy of bringing China into the, rule of law among nations, however you want to, the framework of being a responsible stakeholder. Wonderful. I think that's great also. I'd love to see that. I'm very interested in comments from both of you. My sense agrees with what we've heard here today. It hasn't worked very well, and particularly during the last decade. And some of the actions that the Xi has taken as of late, if anything, increases the risk or raises alarms rather than calms things down. So I'm very curious as to, bringing the strategy of making them a responsible stakeholder, how we improve our results on that going forward. Thank you.
Want me to start? Yeah, the whole stakeholder approach has certainly suffered some blows. And I've been in Washington for 15 years, and it's certainly, particularly among my clients, the Congress, but I think as a whole, wariness and distrust of China has grown tremendously, based on all the activities that Wes has outlined. But as he also mentioned, the whole international liberal order is showing some fraying right now. And it's not just China. The United States has pulled out of an international climate accord too. We've pulled out of the most comprehensive regional trade agreement that was out there in TPP. So it does feel like I wish I could be a little bit more hopeful about ways we can do this. But it's feeling a little bit more like every man for himself out there these days. So if we spiral into really vicious trade disputes, the WTO is another institution that may not have the same power that it did before. So I think it's going to take a lot of solidarity among the Western world in trying to confront this and presenting a united front. I think that Japan can certainly be an important partner in this. But I don't think that you don't hear a lot of policymakers using that approach to frame the China question these days.
The cost for China of its activities in South China Sea, I'll be frank, I mean, it's hard to come up with them. To come up with tangible measures that could be taken that would represent enough of a hit to China that it would back off significantly. I mean, there are people, of course, the voices that argue for a much more muscular military response to these things. I think the U.S. Under any administration is reluctant to get dragged in, pulled into a conflict over what's essentially, rocks in the ocean in many respects. So there's a limit to how much the U.S. is willing to intervene in a military way. And so you have to look at other avenues of pressure. And I think, primarily that involves diplomatic pressure. China cares a lot about its self-image. It's a country that really cares about how it's viewed by the rest of the world as it continues to rise as a great power. So prestige matters to China. And so I think if it's called out and in a consistent way, as I argued in my paper, that can have an effect, I think. And it's really vital, though, that the voices that are calling China out aren't just a single voice, that it's a chorus rather than a solo performance. And that's why I think multilateral institutions create the kind of framework that allows the United States and its partners and allies to express their concerns to China in a way that represents a united front. So I think that's really important. Turning to the responsible stakeholdership, yeah, it is really out of vogue now. And but I do think it's important to come to terms with the fact that the opposite approach, one of isolation, one in which we're unraveling the international order, dismantling international forums and regimes, is one that can very easily snowball into situations where there's greater misunderstandings, more contentious relationships that may eventually lead to conflict. So I'll just pass along another, this could be inside baseball, but another interesting development that happened about a month ago is that the Office of this Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which was a bilateral mechanism that Beijing and Washington put together by former Secretary Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. That office in the Treasury Department, chaired that process. That office closed down about a month ago. And this was seen as the premier sort of bilateral vehicle channel for both sides to hash out their differences, to agree to disagree on things, which I think gets a short shrift, but is actually quite important when you're talking about two countries that could potentially come, to blows over time as strategic rivals. So this office closed down. And I think it's, indicative of some of the problems that we're facing now as we're trying to figure out a way to peacefully encourage China to rise while we're still sort of at the same time pulling apart these very critical dialogues and mechanisms for working out these problems. So it doesn't exactly answer your question, but I think it's a development that we should look at, pay attention to.
Consul General.
Yes, thank you, Carl. I think I would have to be brief, but I just wanted to thank you for, Emma and Weston for participating in this event, and Carl for organizing this, and also for those involved in the council who does this project. We thought it's important to discuss issues from a wider perspective, while all of us are very much preoccupied with North Korean situation, but clearly there is a long-term challenge in the region. So I think that's the reason why we wanted Council to do this project. And if I may talk a little bit about this free and open in China strategy. So I think the basic preposition there is that it's really important to maintain Indo-China ocean maritime order on the basis of rule of law. So in order for us to enjoy peace and prosperity in the region from Asian region towards Pacific, the African countries, so its key element is maintain the maritime order, the oceanic region as a sort of international public goods on the basis of rule of law. So that's the basic proposition when we decided to initiate this strategy. And it was a really great step that two leaders back in November shared a view to promote this strategy. So Weston mentioned the important part of this enhancement of law enforcement capability. I think that's really important for us to continue to cooperate together. And another element we want to add is enhancing connectivity. So infrastructure building as well across the region. So I think that's another area how we can meet the requirements. So the vehicle of this strategy is sort of inclusive. So framework or group of countries are really inclusive. So it's really open to anybody, and also this strategy is not really targeting any single country. So this is something I wanted to add to what those two scholars mentioned earlier. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. All right, so now we enter, so with 7 minutes left, the North Korea section. So there are so many questions here. I'll just go down and read them or paraphrase them, and you can have at them in as you will. One question is directed towards Emma. How much understanding do the members of Congress and their staff members have about North Korea? You can take a shot at that one. How does Japan secure its seat at the table for any major negotiations that will take place for the future of the region, especially as I think they've been, the perception is they've been cut out of what has happened more recently with Kim Jong-un. Leads into the other question we had kind of discussed previously before the event began. Are personal ties with President Trump enough? Well, perhaps have Emma take a shot at that one as well. How can the U.S. maximize its chances of achieving its strategic goals in the upcoming Trump-Kim summit? Is Kim Jong-un willing to denuclearize? National security implications for the Trump administration's changes to trade policy? Oh, that one's not North Korea, so sorry, whoever asked that, it's getting tossed out for the time being. What incentive does North Korea have to denuclearize after looking at the experiences of countries such as Libya or Ukraine? And more importantly, I guess let's start off with this one. So after this one, you can then go back and do it, and I'll ask this to Wes first. What advice would you give President Trump going into his summit with Kim Jong-un? Seems like a nice, easy starting place before we dig into the rest of North Korea. It's a lightning round.
My one piece of advice would be to read the presidential daily briefing.
How much confidence do you have that will happen?
From cover to cover, that is. And then follow the recommendations. Yeah, confidence low. I do think he needs to do a lot of homework before he goes into this meeting. It's really critical that he's up to speed on the traps that Kim Jong-un could set for him. This is really high stakes, and this is something that he is a novice at. He may have a higher than reasonable understanding of his own capacity to do this, but I think it's really critical that he study up and that he makes sure that the United States comes out of this ahead of the game rather than behind it. And it's tricky. I think it's going to be a very sensitive, obviously, and delicate meeting.
Emma, advice for the president?
I think that's a good starting point. I think that, first of all, I'm not totally confident this summit's going to happen. We don't have a date. We don't have a place. These sorts of summits take months and months and months of preparation. And usually, of course, you build up to it, and granting the summit to begin with tends to be, you need to withdraw some concessions. North Korea has wanted to meet one-on-one with the U.S. president for decades, so it's a bit of a coup that they that they even had the president say that. North Korea also hasn't confirmed this, which is actually sort of curious to me, because you'd think this grants them such prestige that they would be trumpeting this, but we have not heard anything from Pyongyang officially. I mean, he got on his train and went to Beijing, which is an important element of this. I would not be surprised if Putin is involved in this in some way too, that I don't know if he pays a visit to Putin, or there's some assertion there of, North Korea sort of like gathering the wagons and seeing what it has in place here. There's a couple of fears about, I'll give you like sort of the spectrum of fears about what happens with the summit. One is that it goes terribly, something goes really, really wrong, in which case the hawks in the administration can say, well, we tried diplomacy, we went right to the top, it didn't work, we're pursuing the military option. And, you may see some new figures, such as a new national security advisor, taking that approach. On the other hand, it could go swimmingly. They could get along really great and have a great time, in which case there's a fear that the allies are going to be sold down the river and their concerns are not going to be addressed in there. So that's sort of the full spectrum. Maybe it'll be somewhere in between, where we have a summit, we don't really know what happened, but it's declared a success by the White House, and it's left to the worker bees in the bureaucracy to try and figure out a way to work towards denuclearization. On this denuclearization question, I think that our definition of denuclearization and North Korea's are different. You also notice in the statements that North Korea and China, they both, or actually China and the South Koreans, because that's how we have heard about this, have both said that the North Koreans are committed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And to them, I think that includes South Korea being included under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And that they will be looking for a reduction of U.S. forces or a withdrawal of, some sort of withdrawal, or South Korea not being included under this extended deterrence structure. So this is a lightning round. I'm not going into these two.
We have 1 minute left in the lightning round.
Japan. Our personal ties with Trump enough. I think that, Abe came out of the gates really strong, right to Trump Tower after he was elected, was very successful in sort of forging a relationship with President Trump. But in the last couple weeks, we've seen, Japan being excluded from the list of allies that are not facing the steel tariffs, which I think is a message saying you have to negotiate bilaterally with us. You're not going to kick this ASO-Pence dialogue down the road again. And there's this North Korea question. I mean, Japan has really strong interests, among them the abductee issue. That's very near the top of their priority list, and there's no guarantee that this is going to be on the agenda if and when Trump meets with Kim Jong-un. Congress. Traditionally, there are a handful of people who really follow the North Korea issue very strongly. It's obviously been a big problem for many, many years. But it is at the top now. That is one thing this administration has done. It has elevated this issue to the very top of our foreign policy agenda. And that means that every member of Congress wants to have an opinion on it. And so we get a lot more requests. They're getting calls from their constituents, in the middle of the country or wherever, saying, are we going to war with North Korea? And suddenly their staffers are coming to us and saying, what's the deal here? What's going on? So we are hearing a lot more. So they're getting a fast education on North Korea, and that's what's kept me really busy for the last year or so.
Wes, anything to add? 1 minute.
Okay, just on the how does Japan get a seat at the table again if it feels sidelined? I think one thing that we might see, this is a little bit provocative, but I think that if there is a Trump-Kim summit, Abe will make moves to try to have a summit with Kim Jong-un as well following the summit. I may stand corrected, but that could be something that Japan does to try to get back in the game if it's feeling sidelined at all. And I think in that, it would be really critical for Abe to actually make some headway with the abductee issue, and that's really difficult. But if he can bring home some abductees, that would be a real coup. And I think he may try to do it.
All right, just to wrap up, and we started off talking about the papers that had been commissioned with the kind of support of the consulate general here. One of the themes that kind of runs through all of them is that as the U.S. steps back, we see Japan stepping forward, and it's kind of a way to ensure, especially in Southeast Asia, kind of leading, kind of being the cheerleader for the Quad, and it's a way to keep the U.S. hopefully involved. So even after there is an administration change or perhaps the policy changes, that the U.S. won't be completely out of the game. It will be able to rely on its allies in the region, which is exactly what we say we want our allies to do. So in that sense, these papers offer a good look at how that is actually happening. With that, please join me in thanking our speakers, and thank you for coming.